Viewers, our top story, a big focus this hour. The ICE summit in Alaska between the presidents of America and Russia concluded the longest face-to-face meeting between the two leaders. After Helsinki, which was in 2018, they met now in 2025. By Donald Trump's own metric, this meeting was a success. He said going into the summit that if he felt that it was not leading to anything positive, he would walk out in minutes. He stayed for the longest time he's ever met Vladimir Putin. On your screens are those visuals that tell what really happened in Anchorage in Alaska, where the two leaders met. Donald Trump rolled out the red carpet for Vladimir Putin. The two leaders walked together after a very warm welcome that the Russian president received. The first time in a decade that he stepped foot on American soil. And then they also rode together in the Beast, which is the vehicle of the American president, where the two leaders managed to speak one-on-one without their delegation. It was a formal delegation-level discussions with 3+3 on both sides for over 2.5 hours. Expectation is that they were thrashing out details of more than just the conflict. It could be largely, the focus would be on the relationship, the bilateral relationship between US and Russia. But remember, the Russia-Ukraine conflict remained the big focus. There were many activists there. There were a lot of Ukraine supporters there. Whole of European capitals were up in arms that they still remained on the sidelines and were not part of this important meeting. And in fact, there was a question that was asked to Vladimir Putin on just that, which was that how long before the hostilities end? Why is it that on ground, the military victories that Russia is getting right now, day by day, is leading to more and more Ukrainian casualties? He appeared to not hear that question from the reporter. Listen in.
Underestimate Ukraine. President Putin, will you stop killing civilians? President Putin, how can the U.S. trust your word?
All right, those were some questions put forth to Vladimir Putin, which he appeared to not hear. Let's also now play out the soundbite of Donald Trump at the press conference, where the two leaders read out their press spoke but did not take any questions. He said, Donald Trump said that there is still no deal on the table. Remember, the ICE summit has ended without any formal agreement about how to end the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Listen in to what the American president said.
I will say that I believe we had a very productive meeting. There were many, many points that we agreed on, most of them, I would say, a couple of big ones that we haven't quite gotten there, but we've made some headway. So there's no deal until there's a deal. I will call up NATO in a little while. I will call up the various people that I think are appropriate, and I'll, of course, call up President Zelensky and tell him about today's meeting. It's ultimately up to them. They're going to have to agree with what Marco and Steve and some of the great people from the Trump administration who've come here, Scott and John Ratcliffe. Thank you very much.
Today, when President Trump saying that if he was the president back then, there will be no war. And I'm quite sure that it would indeed be so. I can confirm that. I think that overall, me and President Trump have built a very good, businesslike and trustworthy contact. And I have every reason to believe that moving down this path, we can come, and the sooner the better, to the end of the conflict in Ukraine. Thank you. As I've said, the situation in Ukraine has to do with fundamental threats to our security. Moreover, we've always considered the Ukrainian nation, and I've said it multiple times, a brotherly nation, however strange it may sound in these conditions. We have the same roots, and everything that's happening is a tragedy for us and terrible wound. Therefore, the country is sincerely interested in putting an end to it. At the same time, we're convinced that in order to make the settlement lasting and long-term, we need to eliminate all the primary roots the primary causes of that conflict, and we've said it multiple times, to consider all legitimate concerns of Russia and to reinstate a just balance of security in Europe and in the world on the whole. And I agree with President Trump, as he has said today, that naturally the security of Ukraine should be ensured as well. Naturally, we are prepared to work on that.
Mr. President, I'd like to thank you very much, and we'll speak to you very soon and probably see you again very soon. Thank you very much, Vladimir.
Next time in Moscow.
Oh, that's an interesting one. I don't know. I'll get a little heat on that one, but I could see it possibly happening. Thank you very much, Vladimir. And thank you all.
The meeting that went on for over 2.5 hours between President Trump and President Putin, along with two members each in their delegation, ended up with no deal here at the joint base, the joint U.S. military base in Anchorage. This meeting, which was quoted as a high-stakes meeting, which was highly anticipated, ended up with no deal or ceasefire. And President Trump said, till there is a deal, there is no deal, which means that now the delegations, and specifically President Trump himself, he said, will be talking to NATO and the Ukraine president. And
All right, now developments coming in thick and fast after the summit ended between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. Now, the American president says the onus lies on the Ukrainian President Zelensky to get the deal done. Donald Trump says he wants to make sure that the deal is done. Now, this is extremely significant. Remember, Ukraine was not part of the summit. They've said all along that we will not allow any decision regarding our future to be taken without us being present on the table. That has never been the case so far with regard to the Trump administration. In terms of what happens next, Donald Trump has made it absolutely clear that for a deal to go through, there is a big and loud message that he has sent to the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, that if you want the deal, then you've got to agree. That seems to be the tone as far as this is concerned. All right, let's go back to Maha Siddiqui, my colleague, joining us live from Anchorage. Maha, we've been speaking through the last couple of hours about this summit, but now developments and after effects have started coming in. Ukraine needs to come in line for any potential deal to actually happen. That seems to be the message here.
Absolutely, Gauri, and a very significant statement there coming from US President Donald Trump. He did not mention it here during the press briefing, but he's saying that now on board his aircraft Air Force One on his way back to Washington, D.C., that the onus lies with President Zelensky now. Now, a similar kind of indication was given by President Putin at the press conference, because President Putin indicated that that President Zelensky now has to take this forward. And in fact, he said, I hope that Ukraine doesn't torpedo this effort and go into some sort of a back channel dialogue. So clearly now, both sides have together pushed the ball in Ukraine's court, but all will depend on what President Putin has agreed to. And that is something that we have not been told. It has not been made clear what are the points on which there was an agreement between the two sides, that is, US and Russia, as they sat down for over 2.5 hours and discussed those points. Some of the points that Russia had already said in the past and in the memorandum in June for a peace deal with Ukraine were points that were totally unacceptable to Ukraine. For instance, that of not being a claimant to the membership of NATO, reducing their army, or territorial swap. Now, territorial swap is something that Ukraine believes will be disadvantageous to it, considering that Russia is, as has already expressed, wants to keep control of the regions that they have wrested control of, rather, in the 3.5 years of the war with Ukraine and earlier on in the annexation of Crimea. And these are vast expanses of land from Ukraine. Nearly 4 oblasts that border Russia are in Russia's control, which are essentially part of Ukraine, including a vast area of Donbas region. So clearly, these will be unacceptable to Ukraine. And under these circumstances, if the onus is being put on President Zelensky, we'll have to wait to see how not just President Zelensky reacts to this, but also NATO.
Indeed, how NATO reacts to this, how all of European allies of America responds to this remains to be seen. But this is essentially what many people were talking. And in fact, President Trump himself was mentioning about territorial stops not likely to happen. That is what the hardening posture was coming in from the Trump administration going into this meeting. But there seems to be a complete change. Now, this was an interview that Donald Trump gave to an American network a short while back after the summit, where he said, make a deal. The deal is only about territorial swaps. Now, if Ukraine doesn't agree to it, are we looking at a deadlock? Are we then looking at Donald Trump changing tack, coming out heavily on Ukraine, what had happened at the beginning of his tenure, early on in February of this year? So that really now poses a completely different set of questions, doesn't it, Maha? Territorial swap was not on the table is what many people believed, but clearly that seems to be the case, that it was very much on the table in terms of negotiations between Trump and Putin regarding how to end the war.
So on the flight, while he was coming from Washington, D.C. to Alaska this morning, this specific question was asked by a reporter about the possibility of a territorial swap. And he did say that we will discuss that issue, but ultimately the decision has to be taken by Ukraine. But now it appears that he has discussed the matter and just simply thrown the ball in Ukraine's court to have a deal now. The deal at which cost, we do not know. What are the territories that are being looked at for swapping? There is no clarity on that. Moreover, when this phrase territorial swap is used, many are asking, what is this swap really going to look like? The word swap means that there has to be give and take. But what is it that Russia is willing to give in return for the territory that they are demanding from Ukraine, which they have wrested control of under this aggression that they have enforced against Ukraine over the past 3.5 years? So very serious questions at play now. What is it exactly that has been discussed? How this deal is going to be, structured? All these questions are remaining at the moment. Gauri, what is also surprising is that if the onus were to be put on President Zelensky, then that should have come through even in the press conference as well. When President Trump said that he's going to speak to President Zelensky and to NATO, and finally the decision will be taken after all these consultations, suddenly within an hour on the flight to say the onus is completely now with President Zelensky, also changing tune from the morning when a reporter on board asked him about if Russia is not willing to make a deal, will you go hammer and tongs against them? And he said, yes, there will be serious consequences for Russia. It seems that President Putin has been able to convince President Trump that he is in the clear and that he is willing to make a deal. But the real problem is Ukraine. And will that line of thought be acceptable to Europe and Ukraine? That is a very big question.
Maha, stay with me because I want to now quickly tell our viewers what is the amount of territory that Russia actually holds right now in this 3.5-year-long war. Now, Crimea is something that Russia annexed in 2014, 9 years back. That time, Barack Obama was the US president. In addition to that, there is also the Donbass region, the Luhansk region. Then there is Zaporizhia. That is another important region. And lastly, Kherson. Put together, all of this adds up to about 20%, a little under 20% of overall Ukrainian territory. You're talking about a 1/5 of Ukraine here, Maha, which is why it is so significant, which is why it's a red line, not just for Ukraine, but for the entire NATO, for all of EU allies of America, that how can a country now go ahead and swap 1/5 of its territory to be able to ensure it gets some sort of a peace formula going. Is Maha still with us? Okay, Maha, let me come back to you and ask you this before I get in Vishal, which is that we're talking about a territory that's 1/5 of overall Ukrainian territory. How can that actually go through? Then are we then looking at, red lines of EU, red lines of NATO, and potentially deal breakers here?
Yes, absolutely. And for a sovereign nation to give up its territory sets a very bad precedent for the world as well. While neighbors can grab territory from the others, that doesn't set a very good example. And in this context, therefore, as Europe has been saying for the last 3.5 years, and Ukraine has been saying for the last 3.5 years, that this is a no-go zone, that we are not going to negotiate on territory which belongs to us and that which has been forcefully taken away from us. Of course, if you listen to Russia's point of view, there's this completely a different viewpoint. It started off with the ambition of Ukraine to join the NATO, and Russia had an issue with security. And today, President Putin pointed that out again, the security balance in Europe, indicating that they are not comfortable with the idea of Ukraine joining NATO as a member. Meanwhile, many, even at that time, believed that this was a smokescreen, that this wasn't the real threat that Putin had, and rather he was using this as an excuse to go and wage a war against Ukraine, and that this was entirely the imperialistic ambitions, territorial grab that Russia was conducting. And if at all the issue now is boiling down to territorial swap, we still do not know. Let there be clarity on that issue, Gauri. Then it comes back to the same point. Was the war only about grabbing territory? Was it nothing to do with the NATO membership of Ukraine? And these questions clearly remain.
And Maha, let me then now rope in Vishal as well to talk us through the big takeaways as far as the summit was all about. Remember, the summit ended a short while back with warm handshakes, bonhomie, cordial relations at play here. The hard negotiations that need to follow is what we are now talking about. Those developments are coming in. But let's walk you through the big takeaways of that summit. Vishal.
So the biggest one is probably Putin saying that he's sincerely interested in putting an end to the war. He has said that in the past as well, but to say that on the biggest platform with Trump, that really is a big takeaway. The second one is Trump hinting at points of disagreement. Although he has not highlighted what those points of disagreements are, but he said that most of the things have been thrashed out. There are few minor details that need to be worked out. It could be the land swap deal that he's talked about in the past, in the recent past as well, but he's not said what are these points of disagreement. So that's another takeaway. Then Putin stresses on need to eliminate primary causes of conflict. So he has started this conflict based on these points of interest, only based on these primary causes of conflict. This so-called special operations inside Ukraine started in February 2022 due to these causes of concerns, because he has said repeatedly that Ukraine has been governed by many Nazis. The population of Ukraine, of which a lot of Russians also are there, they are being suppressed. There is long-term persecution going on, so that needs to be removed. So whether or not he was talking about that needs to be clarified, but he has indeed spoken about the primary causes of the conflict. Moving on, Trump has said there is no deal until there is a deal. So that is probably the biggest highlight of the statement that both the leaders gave just a few hours ago. There is no deal at the moment, even though both the leaders came out all smiles and the bonhomie was shared, but there is indeed no deal. And lastly, Putin has proposed the next round of talks in Moscow. He has, of course, not mentioned Zelensky. Trump himself also did not mention Zelensky. He said that he will call Zelensky, but he did not mention whether there will be Zelensky in the next round of talks. But Putin has indeed, proposed the next round of talks with his counterpart from US. So that will have to be seen. These are some of the biggest takeaways.
All right, let's now get in Alison and Michelle to talk more on this. Alison Federica, Director of Analysis at Geopolitical Futures. Michelle Plitnick, Foreign Policy Analyst and author, both joining me live from Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for speaking to us. The big story that we continue to track, the Alaska Summit, and now fresh developments post that meeting between Russian and American American president joining me on the broadcast are Alison and Mitchell. In fact, Mitchell, let me come to you first in terms of, as I said, the bonhomie, the handshakes, the good optics, all of that has happened. Now you're getting fresh updates. You're getting the fact that Donald Trump has told in no uncertain terms to Ukrainian President Zelensky that he will have to accept the deal, and that deal will only go through if there are some sort of territorial swaps.
Yeah, I think one of the big takeaways is it looks like President Trump told Fox News that one of the things that he's saying to Zelensky is that Russia is a big power and Ukraine is not. That sounds to me like Putin made a case to Trump that he holds the cards and a realistic deal has to be largely on Russia's terms. And I think that's what Trump is moving forward with. I think that's what he is implying with those statements, and that he expects Zelensky to take the deal, at least as far as land swaps. And I suspect as well that Trump probably is sympathetic to the idea of promising Russia that Ukraine will not be able to enter NATO. The United States can certainly rescind the invitation George W. Bush made to them in 2007 to join NATO. Any new member needs unanimous backing. So any NATO member can block that. And if the United States says that there will be no NATO membership for Ukraine, there won't be. So I think this is where Trump and Putin have probably agreed. And I don't think these are terms that are going to sound very good to President Zelensky.
Certainly won't. And it's not just Zelensky alone. Remember, the entire EU ally network of America, NATO, all of them have been very clear that they want to be part of any discussions about the future of Ukraine, including Zelensky himself, who needs to be on the table, because you cannot decide about a country till that country is represented as well. Alison, your thoughts on these updates that are coming in, fresh developments coming in, and also a huge change in stance for Donald Trump. You know, about an hour back, we had those good optics where he said no deal till there is actually a deal. And, you know, it seemed to suggest that there is progress. But now what you're hearing is a completely different stance of the American president, that Ukraine will have to accept what's on the table.
So I think if we think about these talks, it's helpful to think about them in two tracks. One is obviously the Ukraine issue, where Trump is trying to position himself as some sort of mediator where they can get a deal between Ukraine and Russia. At the same time, it's also about the US-Russian relationship, and that is a much broader spectrum than just Ukraine. The sanctions, the Caucasus, a bunch of other places and interests come into play when we think about the US and Russia. What the US can do, and what they're trying to do, I think, here in this case, is they have a broad framework and agreement with Russia. They've obviously agreed to certain aspects of a deal. Putin cannot walk away from Ukraine without keeping some of the territories that were gained. That's just a non-starter for him. What the US can't do is tell Zelensky, you have to accept this deal. However, Ukraine requires US and European financial and military support to continue their war effort. So should the US again, change its stance and movement in terms of what it's willing to offer Ukrainian support, that could significantly constrain what Ukraine is able to do. The EU also would be put in the position of, how do we support Ukraine? They would actually have to put their money where their mouth is. They've given Ukraine some money this week, but that money came from frozen Russian assets, not necessarily from the EU. So it's, when we say putting the ball in their court, it is the US kind of putting constraints on Ukraine and expecting different players to either follow through on what they're saying or to back off. But it is not about necessarily trying to coerce Ukraine, but to try to end the conflict in a way that works for US interests and Russian interests.
19% of Ukraine is under Russian control right now. 19%. Some very large regions. There is Crimea, there is Kherson, there is Donbass, and several others. for territorial swap to happen, for any deal to happen, if the condition is that Ukraine will have to give up all or some part of this territory, then it's all set to be a deal breaker. What happens then is what we are going to now focus on, and what could be the roadmap in terms of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. We will now focus on that after this very short break. Viewers, stay with us. Viewers, our big story continues to be the Alaska summit. The ice has broken between America and Russia. There's been the first time in a decade the Russian president is on American soil. Warm greetings, red carpet welcome. The two leaders exchanged handshakes, they shared laughs, and they spoke the longest they have on a face-to-face meeting, surpassed the previous time they spoke in Helsinki in 2018. Now, has this laid the groundwork for how the Russia-Ukraine conflict will end, or has this laid the groundwork for how Russia-America relationship will now look during the Trump administration for the remainder part of his term, where he's focused on trade, he's focused on critical minerals to be a key aspect of America's relationship with Russia. But the big story, the big update that's come in now, that hours after the summit ended, actually just about a little after an hour the summit ended, President Trump has told an American network that it's now up to Zelensky to take the deal. Now, what's this deal that is in the offing? We don't know. The contours of that hasn't been publicly shared, but it could be the land swap deal. Those are visuals that you're seeing on your screens right now, where earlier when he arrived, the two leaders arrived for the summit venue, they rode in Trump's beast. Those are visuals that came in earlier. Let's get in both Alison and Michelle for more on this. We've been speaking about what could be the potential roadmap or a potential ceasefire deal or agreement that would end the Russia-Ukraine conflict. But the tone, the tenor, the messaging that's come from Donald Trump indicates that the onus will lie solely on Ukraine to accept a deal that it may not do so, given that it would involve a very large amount of its territory going away from it forever and coming under Russian control. Does that mean that we've come back to where we started in terms of 3.5 years later? It's pretty much a deal breaker, Michelle.
You could say we've come back to where we started, but there's a big difference, which is who's in the White House and what their disposition towards Russia is. Donald Trump obviously is much more friendly towards Vladimir Putin than Joe Biden was. I think there were some opportunities under Biden before the situation got to this point, where there were some chances for off-ramps that Biden did not take, that are not really either available to Trump or that Trump wouldn't be interested in any case. I think what we're looking at right now, the word is that Russia is planning a new offensive next month, and if indeed they launch one, Ukraine is going to need significant assistance of the kind that Biden, toward the end of his term, had a very, very hard time getting through the Republican Congress. Eventually he did, but Trump is not going to be inclined to towards that kind of assistance to Ukraine. And he certainly isn't going to have a Congress that's going to push him on it. Mm-hmm. So this is, again, I think this comes back to the question of what Trump said about really Russia being the big power and Ukraine not being a big power, implying that Russia really holds the strategic advantage. And I think Trump is basically saying, look, you don't have the hand to play, something that he said to Zelensky months ago in the White House. And but since then,
Donald Trump's messaging and view with regard to Ukraine has also changed. It also went through a complete cycle from, throwing out Zelensky for not showing enough gratitude in the Oval Office. The lunch was also cancelled, to arming Ukraine with Patriot missiles, and then coming out with its hardening posture against Russia, whether it's secondary sanctions or whether it's several others. It also imposed, the Trump administration imposed fresh 25% additional tariffs on India for importing Russian oil. All that is part of the frustration that Donald Trump felt on not being able to close a deal. Now, after that is when the summit takes place today. And then just hours after the summit ended, it is now the messaging which is Ukraine's got to accept a deal that may just be too much of a red flag. Now, Alison, given the fact that there is no ceasefire, given the fact that there is no end in terms of hostilities, given the fact that Russia has a certain military momentum going in its favor, this kind of posture by Donald Trump is going to further embolden Russian forces, and would that have an impact in terms of how things unfold on ground from a military assault point of view, and also in terms of a final peace formula?
So, as we've seen already, anytime the U.S. has serious talks like these with Russia, Russia will accompany that with a military push or offensive. And that did occur while Trump and Putin were speaking. So part of this is also Russia's move to help to this idea of Russia being a stronger player, of trying to negotiate. If we think of all of the different moves that Trump has done against Ukraine or against Russia or Russia's military offensives, those are all things that can be done to improve negotiating posture and position. What we have seen over the course of the last 3 years with Ukraine is that the Russian advancements militarily have been fairly slow, and that they have not really been able to conduct any type of offensive that would be a critical blow to Ukraine such that they could end the conflict militarily. So while these talks may encourage Russia to continue their operations because they have to for maintaining their posture, negotiations, and talks, what we've also seen militarily from Russia is that they're not in a position right now to do any type of offensive that would create a major change in the battle space in Ukraine anytime in the near future, such that Ukraine would have no choice but to either surrender or accept a deal.
All right. A quick break. I return on the other side and continue this big story. Stay with us, Mitchell and Alison. Viewers, the big story that NDTV has been focusing on, the ICE summit, the Alaska summit in Anchorage has broken ice between Russia and America. But the ceasefire, a deal, the roadmap to ending the Ukraine-Russia conflict remains elusive. No clarity on when, if that will happen. All we know is that there is a possibility of a second summit that may take place in Moscow. That's what Vladimir Putin proposed, mind you, in English for the world to understand and acknowledge that it was the Russian president offering Moscow as a potential venue for the second summit, with Donald Trump first saying that he's going to get a lot of flack or heat for it, but then said he could work around it. Does that mean that the two leaders will meet next in Moscow, or is this yet another instance of good optics that has been at play? Visuals we are putting out showing you instances of smiles, of handshakes, even as the elusive deal continues to be a bit of a problem. Updates have come in since then, where Donald Trump has given out an interview to an American network saying very clearly that now Ukraine needs to accept a deal. Now, what is that deal? The best deal that is on the table from Russia's point of view is that it gets to hold on to whatever Ukrainian territory it has been able to get in the last 3.5 years. That's 19% of the total landmass of Ukraine. Will Zelensky agree to that? Will the EU allies agree to that? Will NATO agree to that? The answer to that is going to be a vehement no, and that tells you that is it a deal breaker. Let's go back to Alison and Mitchell, who continue to be with me on the broadcast. Now, this is a question I throw open to both of you. We've seen a lot of optics at play. We've seen a lot of grand gestures, warm handshakes. All of that is there at play. But essentially, there is no peace formula. Where do we go from here beyond this big messaging that now Donald Trump is doing to Zelensky? Where does the world go from here? Where does the Ukraine-Russia conflict go from here? Mitchell, start first. Yeah.
Well, okay. I think we're going to a place where right now Trump and Putin have now rewarmed their relationship after, as you pointed out, a sort of rough patch where Trump got very angry and took some steps against Ukraine, against Putin. But I think we are not. I never really believed, I have to say, that a deal was going to come out of this meeting or any meeting anytime soon. I think a deal that ends this war is going to be an involved process that has to be directly involving both Ukraine and Russia, as well as Europe and the United States. That's not what we're seeing right now. So I don't see this being resolved. I do see the problem becoming more and more entrenched and more dangerous, frankly, for Ukraine as U.S. support for Ukraine becomes more and more tenuous. Once again, I go back to the fact that I don't see the United States coming up with the massive kind of aid packages that have been required for just to sustain their losses at the level that they've already experienced them and not to lose more. So I think Ukraine is going to feel that its back is against the wall. They're going to turn to Europe. And the real question is how Europe decides to respond to this, because the only way Ukraine is going to have options is if Europe is willing to really step up in a way they have not, and I'm not sure they're even able to, but they certainly have not done so far.
Mm-hmm. Indeed, which also brings me to ask Alison this question about, here in India, here in New Delhi, we've been wondering as to why is it that Donald Trump just woke up one day and decided to impose additional 25% tariffs on importing Russian oil. India is not the only one, most certainly not the largest one, to be importing Russian oil. Many people try to say that it could be because of his growing frustration of not being able to close a deal with Vladimir Putin, and which is why he decided to impose these additional tariffs on India for importing Russian oil. Now, the question is, with no secondary sanctions being imposed afresh, though there was threat of it, do you think that there will now be further change in tack going forward in terms of how the Trump administration views Russia going forward in the wake of these fresh Bonhomme visuals and fresh threatening tone to Zelensky?
So I think the way the U.S. views Russia hasn't changed too much, but the way they've used how they can collaborate and move forward has changed. And if they have been able to reach some sort of broad spectrum agreements on certain critical issues for that bilateral and trilateral relationship with Ukraine, then there's this idea that they can move forward. In particular, with the case of India, I do think that a large part of the sanctions were due to this idea of trying to make an example out of India because of its role of being a strategic U.S. partner, because of its role of being a strategic Russian partner, sending that message.
I disagree, and I disagree very strongly.
Okay.
Which is that, this business of trying to make an example out of India is not going to work, because this also just exposes American hypocrisy. The fact that you tried to do this with China, it came back. They've also imposed their fresh tariffs on America. There's not a word on EU because you cannot do anything about it. EU imports the maximum amount of Russian oil and natural gas as well. So this just exposes hypocrisy on the Trump administration's part, and also the fact that India has responded. We are not going to agree to any trade deal till the time it is on our terms. It's as simple as that. So I take the part in terms of how this is likely to shape up the Trump administration's view going forward, but I disagree on the statement that you made with regard to India. On that note, stay with us. We're going to take a quick break. We return with more updates and developments on this big story that we're tracking. Stay with us, viewers.